Hello and welcome to Mekelle Foresight. This is Mekelle, producer and host of the show. With me today is Professor Kjetil Tronvoll. He is the Peace and Conflict Studies researcher specializing in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Zanzibar. As of 2021, he is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Johannes University College and heads a consultancy firm called Oslo Analytica. He will give us his perspectives on the fast-moving developments in Ethiopia. So Professor Kjetil Tronvoll, welcome to Mekelle Foresight.
Thank you so much for inviting me again.
Thank you. So a few days ago, the war broke out again, after months of some truce. So how did you take it? Was it a surprise for you at all?
It was not such a big surprise. The actual outbreak of the fighting, the timing of that, you could say, I wasn't sure when it would start, but we have had indications during the summer and most certainly during the last week or so of that an attack was imminent. We knew about the deployment of new military personnel from the federal forces and from Amhara regional forces and militia along the Tigrayan borders. We have seen during the last few weeks increasing hostile, if I may use that term, statements from Ethiopian officials and also from military high-level personnel in the federal forces. So patching this together, it was a strong indication that the truce would be broken rather soon and that the military solution would be sought from the side of the party. I think also it is worth noting in this regard that it was a clear sign that the AU-led mediation process was failing, and not only failing, it was stalling and collapsing. And that was also stressed by statements of the Tigray regional government and Dr. Debretsion. So no, it wasn't a big surprise. It was a sad observation, obviously, that it broke out again, the war.
So you said the peace process was bound to fail, or that it was failing. Why do you think so, apart from the signs that you mentioned of a build-up of tensions?
I think the international mediation took off from the wrong footing at the very start. The appointment of President Obasanjo as the High Representative of AU was creating hesitation and suspicion from the side of the Tigray regional government, which was clearly communicated very early on in the process that they didn't really trust the AU envoy and neither the AU chair and leadership. As earlier statements from the Tigray regional government says that the proximity of AU and Obasanjo to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed made them skeptical to their neutrality in the mediation efforts. So the AU, in a situation as we are in when Ethiopia is at civil war, AU is usually paralyzed anyway, because as we know, Ethiopian government's influence in the AU system is extremely high, being the host country. And then we can briefly comment on the other international envoys, particularly the US, but also EU has been involved in trying to mediate or trying to assist the so-called AU-led process. But we also know that the US in particular have had a separate track together with President Kenyatta of Kenya earlier on, which also faltered and failed when Ethiopia both rejected the involvement of President Kenyatta and also rejected the idea to have talks in Nairobi, for instance. And when Kenyatta was voted out of office recently, that was also the end of that kind of process, at least for the time being. There are several other factors which have weakened or at least in my view questioned the effect and the impact of the international mediation, which we have observed, both before the call of humanitarian truce 5 months ago, but certainly also after. The basic premises, for instance, of unfettered, unimpeded humanitarian access to Tigray has never been fully implemented. Yes, we have seen an increase of humanitarian aid to Tigray over the last 3-4 months, but it is not at all at the level needed to supply humanitarian aid to the famine-struck population of the region. And the fact that humanitarian access and the basic principles, the core basic principles of international humanitarian law was not pushed and taken for granted by the international mediators, as it should be, but was posed as somehow part of a negotiation process, clearly indicate that the strength, the push, the pressure on the Ethiopian federal government to accept the basic principle of international humanitarian law indicates that the process from the very start, as it relates to international mediation, was kind of played by the tune piped from Addis Ababa. It was not a genuine, balanced pressure on both sides of the conflict.
Following up on that, let me ask you about the issue of preconditions. The Addis Ababa government had said it was ready to negotiate without preconditions. But isn't it a precondition by itself to say negotiations first before allowing in food aid and lifting the chokehold on basic services?
Exactly, that's a key point. The Ethiopian federal government claim that they're willing to negotiate anywhere, anytime without preconditions, but they are, that in itself, when they are blocking humanitarian aid to the civilian population of Tigray, when they have a siege, cutting telecommunication, electric power, banking, all kinds of services to the civilian population of Tigray, and they are not willing to lift the siege before negotiations, that in itself is the basic precondition, so to say, from the government side, that they are claiming then that humanitarian access, the basic services to the civilian population should be negotiated as part of a peace process.
Which is against international law, humanitarian law, right?
That breaches the fundamental core issues of international humanitarian law. Why international humanitarian law was established in the first place was exactly to protect civilian population from the belligerent parties. That the war, yes, can be fought, and it is allowed to fight the war, but the principle of distinction is the key, that you should make a distinction between combatants and civilians should be protected in all cases, so to say, with humanitarian access, medical supplies, to leave the battle zone, and so on and so forth. All of these basic principles of distinctions have been breached by the federal government of Ethiopia, and they pose that as part of a negotiation process, which obviously breaches international humanitarian law. We have seen the statements, yes, from US, from EU, that they say that humanitarian access should be guaranteed immediately. That's fine, that's very good, but we have seen a lack of pressure on the Ethiopian federal government to actually obey by that basic principle. It is just statements after statement after statement, and the situation have remained more or less the same.
What do we know of the peace process, the direct talks, the proxy talks, and why they failed?
Well, we have known, at least kind of from confidential sources, that there has been a long-term process of indirect talks between the two parties in Addis and Mekelle, communication between the envoys, be that the AU, US or EU envoys, and other third parties too. But the speculations that there were face-to-face meetings have earlier been rejected by both sides actually. But then again, disclosed by Dr. Debretsion in his open letter to the international community just a few days back, where Dr. Debretsion claims that on 2 occasions there have been high-level meetings between political leadership in Mekelle and Addis, as well as military leadership on both sides, where they agreed upon some principles of a formal cessation of hostilities, not the informal truce as we have seen declared over the last few months, but also then some basic principles on furthering a mediation process. As part of this trust building process, we know that earlier it was agreed then of release of prisoners of war from both sides. Mekelle obeyed by it and released 4,000, I think, Ethiopian prisoners of war. Ethiopia should reciprocate to release Tigrayan prisoners of war or Tigrayan personnel under arrest, which was never implemented, which was a clear breach in this trust building process. And this again is not something new. If you remember when the declaration of humanitarian truce was called by Addis Ababa some 5 months back, that was actually also part of a confidential talk process where both sides should agree and announce jointly a truce. But then suddenly Addis breached that and declared unilaterally humanitarian truce, which later was followed up then by Mekelle. So on several occasions, principles which have been agreed apparently in the confidential talks, mediation, has later been breached or not followed up by the federal government of Ethiopia. And in these kind of instances, in such processes of mediation, which obviously need to be kept confidential because of face-saving mechanisms and so on, that's fully natural that the initial negotiations about negotiations, so to say, talks about negotiations are kept confidential from the public eye. The most important thing in such a process is to build trust between the parties. Even though they are at war, you can still have trust between individuals and between the parties who strive then towards the common objective of settling such a political discord, which have then converted to a military confrontation. When that trust is breached over and over and over again, obviously it weakens the substance and the drive of such mediation process. And that's what we see the results of with the collapse of mediation now today totally. And it's a number of factors. I've touched upon some few of them, but it's much more complex than that, obviously, both in terms of personnel allocated to the process from the international community side, the resources from the international community allocated to facilitate such a process, the expert base of the envoys, for instance, can be seriously questioned. How much do they really know about the complexities of Ethiopian politics and history and ideology and cultures? How can they understand the Addis-Mekelle conflict in relation to all the other conflicts happening in Ethiopia at the same time and so on? Do they know personally the individuals involved on both sides, which is obviously a benefit? So I think obviously the outbreak of war again is to blame on the parties themselves, not the international mediators. But from my point of view, it is also a clear indication that the lack of resources, the lack of political weight invested by the international community into the mediation process is also a failure in its own right.
So litany of broken promises, and as you showed, that the Addis Ababa government, was violating left and right all these promises that were agreed upon in the negotiations. So what does that tell about the interlocutors, their credibility, their effectiveness?
Well, as I said, I take a disclaimer here that apparently, as we know, because I don't have the full insight into these processes, so I don't know what Mekelle, the Tigray regional government have breached, and not all the issues which the Ethiopian federal government have breached, if so. So, but what we can pick out of it, it seems to be that it's mostly the federal government of Ethiopia which haven't followed up on the promises made in the process so far. What does it tell about the mediators and their impact? Well, as I said, I think we have seen a shift. And we saw the shift already last year, for instance, on how US related to the conflict and how they have shifted, or how they have taken more aside in the process. We can see that out of the statements made, and how the actors relate, and how the capital, Washington, D.C., the White House, the State Department, the USAID are relating to the federal government of Ethiopia versus the regional government of Tigray. So clearly they have leaned towards Addis Ababa when it comes to understanding the process, to use that term. And again, that's natural. I have to be blunt on this. Obviously, government which have formal diplomatic relations to a country where you have a civil war, it has to relate to the recognized government of that country, which is the Prosperity Party and Abiy Ahmed. It is the international recognized government, and it will take quite a lot for any bilateral partner to work to take a strong critical stand on such a government, so to say. It's much more easier to be openly critical and condemning towards a subnational local authority, as the Tigray regional government is, and a political party, a political actor, a military non-state actor, as the TDF is. It's very easy for the international community to be very critical to a non-state military actor, because the international system, it is not geared into recognizing or giving authority to such a belligerent actor. The international system is geared into and built upon state-to-state relations. And the recognized government of Ethiopia is the Prosperity Party. So that the mediators are leaning in favor of the recognized government of Ethiopia in such a process is not a surprise.
But at stake here is the lives of 7 million people. Shouldn't humanity supersede other considerations?
Certainly so. Certainly so. Don't misunderstand me. This is not my personal opinion. It's just reflections on how the international system is. I think it is taken into consideration exactly what you're saying, Mekelle, that you have 7 million people who have been cut off from the world. It's probably one of the most isolated geographical areas in the globe over the last 2 years is the Tigray regional state. And the area where people are suffering most in terms of humanitarian needs, medical needs, social needs, economic needs, educational needs, you name it. And the level of suffering the people of Tigray are enduring is not reflected in the international community's attention to this case. And that's just a cynical observation from my end. And that's how the international system works. The international system are not geared into necessarily elevate the plight of the Tigrayan people to the level they deserve and to the level needed to put in place an effective mediated peace process. Because the pressure put upon the federal government of Ethiopia, as we have seen, is not that high. Yes, for instance, after the terrible bombing of Mekelle yesterday, and the killing of children in a kindergarten, an obvious civilian target. Well, there might be 3 reasons for hitting that area. It's just a blatant mistake by the Ethiopian Federal Air Force, which has shown over and over again that they are not competent in hitting the targets they want to hit. They might have aimed at the military target outside this area and then just hit wrong. They might have done it consciously, deliberately, in order to inflict fear and terror among the civilian population of Tigray. in the hope of, as we have seen their strategy have been, in the hope of that the civilian population should turn against the regional government and TPLF to eject them, so to say, from within. The third possibility, in my view, it might be that there were some high-level political individuals in this area they wanted to kill off. Maybe some of the party leadership or the regional government leadership they wanted to aim at. We don't know. But no matter the reason, it is an obvious direct breach of international humanitarian law once again that you are targeting civilian population in such bombing raids. And the international condemnation after this raid has been more or less not visible. Yes, I've seen a couple of statements that encouraging both sides not to hit civilian targets. Again, this both-sidism. The only concrete statement, as for, I haven't seen all, but I saw UNICEF, the children organization of UN, they came out with a condemnation because of killing of children at the kindergarten in Mekelle. So if it had been the other way around, to use that term, if Tigray regional state had an air force and bombed a civilian location in Addis Ababa, I'm certain that the condemnation have been 10 times stronger in this regard. So that's how this is played out. It is much more difficult for any international actor to be very strong, to inflict high-level pressure politically on a legitimate, internationally recognized government. The government of Ethiopia is not on pair, for instance, with the government of Myanmar, who is doing an active genocide against the Rohingyas. There you have a high-level kind of acceptance, at least in the Western world, that you can condemn the government of Myanmar as the bad guys. That acceptance doesn't exist against Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the Prosperity Party. And you see that a lot of the bilaterals and the international community are having a much more lenient attitude, much more apologetic attitudes, much more understanding attitude towards the Prosperity Party and Abiy Ahmed. That's something the Tigrayan regional authorities have to factor in when they, hopefully, or when everyone has to factor in if a new peace mediating process will resume after this round of fighting is over.
The WFP's allegation of theft of fuel by Tigray forces seems to have overshadowed more pressing events like the resumption of the fighting, even after the clarification by the government of Tigray that it was actually reclaiming of loaned fuel, and even after the killing of civilians, including children, through aerial bombardment in Mekelle. What do you say to that?
It's just a very good example of exactly what I'm telling you, or trying to explain to your audience, that the treatment of such information will be very different relating to the government of Tigray versus the federal government. First of all, I can say that, as I also said in my tweet, it might be, it might be correct to criticize the regional government of Tigray in the way they reclaimed the fuel. I don't know the inside story to all of that, but I know the attempt of it at start, which was then denied by the World Food Programme staff at the warehouse in Mekelle, and then they came back and took it by force, so to say. A possibly wiser thing would be to announce it publicly and to go international with it before reclaiming it. Because as soon as they reclaimed it, the narrative was immediately spun that it was a theft, it was stolen under arms from a main humanitarian actor. And you saw the tweet by the WFP chief, which used even caps in his tweet, which was kind of unbecoming of such a person of that stature, at least assumingly that stature. And that narrative was picked up by a lot of foreign ministers across Europe, for instance. And then when the Tigray regional government came out the day after explaining that this was actually, they were terminating a loan and they needed that fuel for other priorities according to their needs, it was too late. And very few of the Western governments have picked up, so to say, or have acknowledged the fact that what Tigray regional government did was cashing in on a loan given to the World Food Programme. And it illustrates again, and you know, all these cases that the Tigray regional government are fighting an uphill battle when it comes to convincing the international audience, the international community about their situation. And they don't have that many friends internationally. They have hardly any international friend when it comes to governments in the Western world, or in the Middle East, or in China or Asia for that matter. You're fighting more or less alone in this sake, and that has to be factored in the way also the regional government of Tigray should communicate their cause and should be more aware of exactly that situation. Whatever is done from Mekelle is susceptible to be criticized by the international community going forward.
Well, both sides have been stuck to their guns so far, both insisting on their entrenched positions. So what do you think is the alternative?
I don't see, you know, from my point of view, as I've said over and over and over again over the last more or less 2 years, is that I don't see how this can be easily solved through a mediation process or through war. And what we thought, you know, when it is a situation like this in international conflict theory, so to say, after a period of war, you both sides, without any side winning on the battlefields, you come to a situation where you have what is called a mutually hurting stalemate. Both sides kind of come to the recognition that they cannot win this by arms, so they need to go to the negotiation table to find some kind of compromise on the key issues of discord. We thought that phase started then with the call of a humanitarian truce, or at least the mediators thought so or hoped so. But in my point of view, the position still on the key issues of West Tigray, territorial claims, on the political autonomy claims and the referendum on Tigray, and the status of Tigray under or in relation to Ethiopia. These are very hard to see to be negotiated as the situation is today in Ethiopia through mediation, because basically Abiy Ahmed doesn't have control. Abiy Ahmed controls Addis and the palace and Arat Kilo and some areas of Ethiopia, but Abiy doesn't control Amhara regional government or Amhara regional states' interests in the conflict on Ethiopia. So on those key issues, which have been presented as preconditions from the Tigray regional government, that these are non-negotiable issues, if then a mediation starts, and that is the perception in Ethiopia, a lot of key actors in Ethiopia will turn against Abiy Ahmed because they are principally against that fact of returning, for instance, West Tigray to Mekelle. So from my point of view, I have never seen that issue would be, or that those issues will be realized through mediation. So yes, you have had the possibility to talk about talks. You have had the possibility to talk about humanitarian access. You have had the possibility to talk about lifting the siege. But these issues have also been kind of presented as non-negotiable because they are obvious, because they are the basic principles of international humanitarian law. So what then should you talk about? What then should you mediate about when each side would not, at least conceivably in the near future, come to an agreement on it? So it has been a lull in the fighting just to prepare for a new round of fighting has been my position for the last, since 2022, so to say. And the
developments proved you right.
Well, sadly so, yes. That this the mutual hurting stalemate has not risen to the level where it is universally acknowledged on both sides that this cannot be solved by arms. Because still, obviously, there are decision makers who believe that they can solve this by violence, by arms.
A mutually hurting stalemate, in your words. Let's assume this stage is reached. Do you think the world will have learned a lesson and reconfigure the mediation process? Because clearly, as we have seen it, the AU-led mediation has failed.
Sadly, I don't think they will learn on those issues, no. I think they will continue along the same path. I think the first test in this, obviously, will be how the internationals, meaning US and EU, will relate to the fact if whether or not AU should still be so-called in the lead, that it should be an AU-led mediation process. If that will be continued to be supported by US and EU, nothing is learned. You saw that AU also kind of accepted that a couple of weeks ago, or some days ago, when they said that when they invited in formally US and EU to be part of still an AU-led process. So that is a first step. But certainly AU needs to take the back seat and not the driving seat when it comes to a possible restart of a mediation process. Or first of all, President Obasanjo has to be replaced by someone who has the trust on both sides. That's a basic principle of any mediation, that if a mediation should be successful, the mediator needs to hold the trust on both sides of the conflict line. If it is only the trust on one side, obviously the other side will be suspicious of the whole mediation efforts. So to come to an agreement where the lead mediator has the acknowledgement and trust on both sides is the first step. That might be possible to find if Abiy is willing to do so. So far, he hasn't been willing to change Obasanjo. He has said it is Obasanjo or nothing. But it is way more difficult than that, because if you also read carefully the international statements from the US and State Department Secretary Blinken and also from the EU, the emphasis now more or less in all statements are the preserved continuation of the territorial integrity of Ethiopia. That no mediation should alter the integrity and sovereignty of Ethiopia. And that's, again, obvious position for any international to take, where the international system is built upon the fact of the sacredness of the state. But from the Tigrayan viewpoint and from the Tigrayan people's viewpoint, that's exactly what you want to negotiate. Your right to decide yourself, to determine yourself the future of Tigray region. And if that is discarded or rejected from the outset for any international mediator, how can you reconfigure such a process? So I think I'm speaking from a very realist viewpoint in international relations, that this is basically about power, and it's a bargaining process where power is the key issue, meaning political power, military power, economic power was not. But in this phase we are entering now, when the mediation have collapsed, it is the military power which dictates the next possible mediation process. That's the blunt assessment of it. If you win the battle, you might dictate a mediation process. I'm not saying winning the war. If you win the war, it is no mediation. You don't need mediation if you're winning the war. But if you're winning the battles consecutively, you might also dictate the mediation process. That's very blunt. I have to be frank on it. And that's what we have seen throughout, that that's also the thinking of the conflicting parties.